everybody. Welcome to our Lunch and Learn today. We are here to talk about leading through a crisis. I know obviously we've all recently gone through COVID, but there are other things going on in our life and in our world, in our professional careers and in our professional circumstances that can be a crisis. It's not all necessarily COVID related. It can be anything related. And how are we preparing ourselves to make the most out of this situation? Can we turn a crisis into an opportunity? We've got an incredible guest speaker with us today. His name is Herb Dyer. Herb is the former Chief Operating Officer for Seton Healthcare, where he managed a $400 million operating budget and led over 2,000 employees. Herb is now an executive coach where he helps people excel and inspires them to be their very best. Herb, thanks for being here today.
Absolutely. Thank you.
So, Herb, we're here to talk about leading through a crisis. I think maybe the first question I have is, what does it mean to be a leader? Can you be a leader even if you're not necessarily in a leadership position?
Oh, absolutely. I think one of the things when I look back at supervising my team or my staff is, number one, empower folks to make decisions. I think it's important that when you allow folks the confidence, the fact that they are in a position where they can help the team to advance, I think it just builds that level of trust across the board. And during times of crisis, you're going to have situations where that particular decision maker may not be readily available. So in that case, you have people on the team who are capable of making decisions so that the team continues to make progress without any disruption.
I think that makes a lot of sense in talk, but what I've seen a lot of application is a lot of leaders micromanaging, where they're making the decisions because they want it to be perfect. One of the things I've heard, I think it was from Facebook, is that done is better than perfect. How can we catch ourselves when we're potentially micromanaging or potentially not letting others decide or make their own decisions? How can we catch ourselves and how can we pull back?
Sure. So I think one of the things that's important around that, and one of the things I'm coaching is around neuroscience, is the level of confidence, trust, the ability to feel comfortable in having a voice at the table. I think it's important that leaders allow for the team members to voice their opinions, to frankly criticize that leader for a decision or a situation that the team or individual on that team may feel that is not the correct thing. And I think leaders need to be in a position where they're vulnerable to admit to the fact that, hey, I made a mistake, or you know what, good point, I didn't consider that. So, let's revisit as a team and make a decision that's going to be best for the team. So I would say to you, it's important that leaders are in a position where they're vulnerable and allow for other folks at the table to have a voice so that the team can operate at its maximum level, its optimum level.
I think that similar to that before, I think it makes a lot of sense in the theory of it, but I see it so often, a lot of leaders where they'll say that exact thing, but their actions won't follow through. Have you ever experienced anything like that? How do you help kind of like those leaders become self-aware, where they say things like, oh yeah, my team is always honest with me or always transparent. I expect honesty and people being thorough and precise and giving it to me straight. But in reality, behind the scenes, something happens and they get really frustrated at something that potentially slights their ego or isn't done the way that they had expected it to be done, and they're struggling to take the blame or accountability for it. How do you help leaders kind of come to grips with that?
Sure. So, there's several steps in doing that. One of the things I've always defaulted to is survey. You have, whether it's anonymously done or have individuals just basically provide feedback to that direct supervisor. Of course, that supervisor, again, needs to have confidence in his or herself so that they can accept criticism constructively and respond in accordance. So I would say the first thing is, if you're truly interested in growing professionally, growing personally, is that you allow for your team members or the folks you work with to provide you constructive criticism. Secondly, I think as a leader, if you're going to grow, you need to place yourself, again, and I used a term before, vulnerable, making yourself vulnerable where, again, those individuals who are reporting to you, they feel and see that you are, hey, you're human. And in that case, if you behave that way, again, you build trust and you bank strong return on investment when you show your vulnerability.
Hey, Herb, I have a question for you. And you're studying neuroplasticity. And a lot of the things, I know you and I have talked about this before, is a lot of the stuff is subconscious. So you said something that was really profound and interesting is leaders that aren't confident. Those leaders may not know that they're not confident. So how do you scratch at that and get into that to enable them to see that they need to allow vulnerability? Because it all sort of trickles down.
Sure. So I would say there are a few things that can be done. I mean, like one of the things my company, what we do is provide DISC assessment, right? Or frankly, we look at it from other types of personality assessments so that leader can understand who she or he is in terms of where those strengths and weaknesses are. We tend not to use weaknesses, we tend to say opportunity, right? So I would say, first and foremost, know yourself. Then you open yourself up to where those criticisms can be accepted, whether it's one-on-one. It's probably going to take a little bit of while to do that because, let's face it, egos. And I think a little bit here, Tori, when you look at egotistical individuals, as a road cyclist, that's one of the biggest set of egos you can find. Yeah. And I think it's a matter of building trust with that individual, particularly from a coaching perspective, to say, hey, here are the opportunities you have to make your team the most successful. But again, you have to open up yourself to constructive criticism or frankly, feedback from the team.
So that leads me to the next question is, it's not enough to know, and you and we know this through neuroplasticity. It's not enough to know. So who holds these people accountable after they've done a DISC assessment? And not only that, but who holds them accountable? And how do you get someone you have to create a discipline before it becomes a habit. So how do you, it's got back to, it's not enough to know. So what's the next step that you would advise people to take?
Well, I would say, especially if it's a leader, I think it's important to invest in a coach, okay? Because accountability, unless, of course, you do a peer advisory. So you can develop peer advisory within your organization as well, where confidential information, conversations are held, where true sensitive information can be shared, but it's understood that those individuals in the room will maintain high confidentiality and not, create conflict by using their ego, so to speak. So I would say, going back to the original point of having a coach where those meetings are occurring, whether it's on a weekly or bi-monthly or whatever time schedule is prepared, that individual, that leader, is reporting back based on whatever mutual assignments that were put in place. So I think it's important that accountability is put in place where that individual is reporting back whatever progress is being made. If you don't have buy-in from the top, particularly, especially if you put coaches in place, these things won't work because it's all about accountability.
So Herb, on that level and on that same, notion, how important is it to set clear expectations? As a leader, how critical is it to set clear expectations for other people you work with so they know what to expect from you?
Yeah, the Berkman is another assessment that we use. It's I usually use the term the grandfather of personality assessment. And it truly shows you where in your behavior, for example, where you're stressed, how you behave differently. And I would say to you, in terms of when individuals come together, it is important. It's very important that expectations are laid out from whether it's an orientation to a particular project or a relationship. What are my expectations as a leader from you? So whether it's delivering something on a weekly basis, whether it's preparing a report to identify here's a status, whatever it is that you define, and again, whether it's relevant to your job description or whether it's deliverables for that particular project, I think it's important to make sure you have that conversation and revisit that, particularly when you're having maybe your one-on-one session or your group meetings or whatever the case may be. Let's face it, when people get busy, they're going to address what is most urgent and won't necessarily look at what is, okay, let me check the box by doing these things. So it's really important that conversations may be put in place consistently, again, whether it's, one-on-one meetings or group meetings, or frankly, whatever form of communication that you may do.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think that makes a lot of sense. I can see a lot of relevance there, in the sense that you can see a lot of leaders sometimes getting frustrated at their teams, or potentially the outcomes that they weren't able to achieve, or the people that were supposed to be doing this and they didn't end up doing that. It seems like almost kind of what you're getting to, and I might be making a leap here, but radical accountability. Whereas if we don't, on our side, set the proper expectations, if our team doesn't get the things done that they need to get done, it's not their fault, it's our fault, because we didn't equip them with what they needed to get what they needed to get done. Even, by the way, this transcends our title. This could be, if I'm, let's say, not even in title, let's say a leader at my company, maybe not necessarily as a manager per se, but as somebody, as an individual contributor. If we're working together towards achieving this outcome, if I take it on myself to say, hey, this is what I need you to do, and this is the specific expectations, I can put myself in the best position to have a successful outcome. And if it's not, it falls on me. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you as the leader for that project or for that organization, if your team fails to deliver, it's your fault. It's your problem. And what it means here is that obviously if you have individuals on the team, that don't have the acumen or don't have the skill set, or frankly, or if they're not disciplined in delivering, then you need to move. There's a saying, you know what, people to get off the bus. So ultimately, if people don't deliver, it is your responsibility as a leader to make sure that conversations and changes, processes are put in place to improve up on that. One of the things, and I'll go back to cycling, Tori, when you talk about we're in a pace line going 25, 26 miles an hour, and there's a pothole and the person that's in front of you doesn't point it out, you know what's going to happen. You're going to have an accident. So when you ride, there are expectations, there's an orientation, particularly if you are a seasoned rider, you have a responsibility, safety first. You're going to make sure you look out for the person who's right on your wheel, right behind you. So those are the things that are important, that as a leader, if you don't point out, if you don't provide a job description, if you don't review those job descriptions and expectations with the individuals on your team, yes, it's your fault if the team fails.
Great point, Herb. So the topic of this presentation or this lunch and learn today is on how to lead in a time of crisis. I guess, could you convey to me a little bit of the difference between what it takes to be a leader in a time of crisis versus a time of growth or peace? I think Ben Horowitz in his book, The Hard Thing About Hard Things, wrote, having a wartime leader versus a growth and peacetime leader, and that there's two different skill sets to be successful in both different scenarios. I don't know if you've heard of that scenario before, Herb, but I'd love to learn your thoughts on that and what kind of skills it takes to be successful in both scenarios.
Sure. One of my favorite leaders is Winston Churchill. Okay. I mean, some of his social behaviors weren't necessarily something I admire, but I admired him as a leader, particularly when, bombs were raining down on England at that point. This guy he never gave up. He spoke to folks and he said, hey, these are the things that we will do to succeed. And he was also a strong influencer. That's how, frankly, the United States got into the war, because he influenced Roosevelt, right? I would say to you that as a leader, you need to have and embrace grit in your character. You need to have grit. You need to have courage, and you need to be able to make adjustments. The leaders that put themselves in a position to make adjustment, such as what we refer to as change management, they are more successful. You got to make adjustments. In healthcare, for me, the pandemic, as we know it, this occurred 100 plus years ago. I think it was the last major flu we had was 1919, if my memory serves me right in terms of historical readings. But I would say to you, we have seen other areas, like, for example, Ebola, SARS, from the healthcare side, where we knew, frankly, if we didn't have the processes in place from the national level to the local level to the hospitals, if we didn't put those processes in place, and the various teams, whether the pharmaceutical companies or the physicians and the individuals who were also providing care to the patients, if we didn't put those things in place by having conference calls nationally, statewide, as well as locally, if we didn't put those processes in place, we probably would have seen a similar situation to what we're having right now. So I think it's important that when you are having a crisis moment, you need to pull folks in. You need to review what the standards and expectations are in order to contain and manage that crisis or that crisis moment. And obviously, we have had many, many crisis moments in this country, from what is natural in terms of what is referred to as, okay, that was a God-given activity that took place, right? It's a natural occurrence. The man-made, 2007 to 2009, where toxic loans created a housing crisis and, frankly, created the Great Recession. So the point is that if you have standards in place as leaders, you need to make sure those standards are sustained, maintained, and, frankly, revisited to make sure that you're innovative in putting whatever processes that needs to be put in place to deal with that crisis. Does that make sense?
Makes a ton of sense. One skill you talked about that I love if you could define a little bit further is grit. I think we hear this term a lot. What does that mean?
So, one of the champions of that for me is Duckworth, Professor Duckworth. And she basically talked about, how do you develop grit? And it's not necessarily because you're the greatest athlete or the brightest person or the best musician. The point of developing grit is taking on a goal, taking on a goal that's particularly maybe challenging or maybe a stretch goal, and working at it. And I think you said earlier about habit, and I think Tori may have been the one that talked about that, right? When we obviously practice something over and over and over, we become skilled at it. That's just a human thing. Whether it's mental or physical, it's learned muscle. So I would say to you, grit for me, how I would describe it, is taking on a goal, even when it's difficult, and doing what needs to be done to accomplish that. Why I talked about Churchill is, again, he never gave up. And in probably, most humans, if they were looking at his situation, they probably would have said, you know what, no mas. They would have brought the white flag, because it was hard, it was scary. So I would say grit to me is having courage and having the tools to face adversity and not give up. But also, as a leader, is also teaching the people who are reporting to you to understand that it's not an easy outcome, but if you practice these things, you will develop the skills to exhibit grit tendencies.
And what about in a time of relative prosperity? So perhaps we're not in a crisis, but I'm wanting to amplify my skills as a leader. I don't want to become stagnant. How can I amplify my skills as a leader even when times aren't in a crisis?
Well, I think that's where change management, or the concept around change management, comes into play. When things are easy, the reality is life is not constant. It's not consistent. You're going to have some bump or object that's going to fall in the space. And I'll give you an example. We went for a ride about a month ago, and we decided, because of some of the elements, meaning that it was hot and humid. And particularly for me, I don't perform very well when it's super hot. So what we did, we agreed we'll ride early in the morning. And we went out at 5 a.m. We had lights, we had all the equipment on our bikes. Make a long story short, going at 22 miles an hour, there was a dead armadillo in the road, and we missed it. We missed it. So the 5 people in front of me didn't see it, didn't point it out to me, and I hit it head on, and ultimately I fell off the bike and had some road rash. So the point of the matter here is, even with the best plan, lights on the bike, mechanically everybody was set, we knew what we needed to do, things happen. So you need, at this point, we made adjustment and made it clear, I'm not riding at 5 a.m. in the morning. If we are, we won't be doing a pace line at 21 miles an hour. We're going to ride with more of safety in mind. So that's where the adjustment comes into play, that you can't always accomplish what you may have originally planned. You may have to make adjustment. The most important piece of that statement is learning from your mistakes and applying solutions to take care of what those mistakes that you experience or that the team may have experienced. Make sense?
Makes tons of sense. It makes me think of Pixar when they created the brain trust. So at Pixar, essentially, after they made Toy Story 1, Bug's Life, and then Toy Story 2, Toy Story 2 was a total disaster. They hired in outside producers and directors. The first draft of the version, after they had completed it, was not all the way complete. It was not emotionally gripping. The story wasn't great. And so the leaders of Pixar had a choice. Do we keep this because we poured hundreds of millions of dollars into it, but it's not a great story? Or do we throw it totally out and start over? And they started over. But they built out those protocols of a brain trust where every week or every 2 weeks, every one of their directors that are putting together a movie, whether it be Finding Nemo or The Incredibles or anything, they had to meet with the brain trust to make sure that the movie was not getting offline, and that brain trust allowed for the director to do it. And they didn't have that before. So it makes me think of that as just like you learn from those small mistakes, but they give you context for how you can be better later on.
And great point, because that's a great analysis or a great metaphor when you think about how do you address, in one sense, perfection. How do you try to accomplish perfection? Sometimes you're going to lose a little bit of time, whether it's a time schedule or investment. But at the end of the day, if you had put out that movie that may have cost $400 million or $500 million or whatever it costs, the return on your investment would have been a negative. So, great point.
Yeah. Well, actually, funny thing about Toy Story 2, the other funny thing about it was they actually had a developer on the second time when they remade it. The developer typed in a code, he hit a key and pressed enter, and it deleted everything. Everything. Buzz, Woody, all the characters, Mr. Potato Head, gone. But fortunately, one of their employees, who was a developer, was pregnant at the time. She was working from home back when that wasn't normal. And she had backed up the whole movie every single night on her personal hard drive. So they ran to her house, picked it up, and then they built in protocols of like, you can't auto-delete all the code. But just like that, same exact thing. Pretty crazy.
Awesome. And it's interesting how you said when it wasn't normal to work from home. Also, I guess some companies would probably have a policy where you can't keep business information on your personal file, right? But in the meantime, let's say that they had that in place, they were probably saying, thank you very much, right? So.
Oh, yeah, big time.
Yes.
So I'd love to ask, how can we turn crisis into opportunities? How can we take things that perceptively look like a negative, look like we're getting smacked in the face with them, and it's not great? How can we turn that into an opportunity?
Well, first and foremost, you need to be optimistic, right? Crisis, accidents, problems are going to take place. So you need to be optimistic to say, I am going to reach into my toolbox. I am going to reach into my network. I am going to bring all of the bright folks that I know together on my team to talk about how we can make this crisis a non-crisis, or what can we do to look at things in an innovative fashion to provide, if it's a business, provide services in a different way. If it's a product that we have to develop, how can we refine a product? And again, it's simply bringing in, I think you used the term before, brain trust, mastermind, peer advisory, bringing people to the table to have a conversation. And you can see there are some businesses that are doing very well, right? You know, whether it's delivery services or, you know, Uber or whatever it is that's going on in terms of how do we adjust for this, you know, working from home, you know, refining the remote tools that we use to better communicate with each other. I think we need to look at all our businesses in a similar way and say, you know what, we deliver it, you know, this one way in normal time. What do we need to do to continue delivering the services to our customers by using a different route, even if it's temporary, right? It's understand that you're going to have to make adjustments, because if you don't, you're going to ultimately close your doors. I think the restaurants have figured out somewhat that they can still do their services because, you know, deliveries are available, you know, 25, 30, whatever percent it is that of the infrastructure space that we have to use, we'll use that. But the bottom line is that you have to think innovatively. You don't want to be a BlackBerry. You don't want to be a Kodak in the sense of saying, hey, this works great, so we have a great tool here, we don't need to fix it. You always have to think, how do I improve on the delivery of my product, my service, my people? How can we improve on that? And I would also say, when you think about the surveys that were done by, I think, Gallup, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, Harvard Business Review, they have showed where employees across this country, diverse industries, diverse services, 50+% of the employees are not happy. And I think part of it is that companies haven't figured out how to improve direct supervisors' relationship with their staff. And until we fix that, you're going to continue to have that problem.
That makes a lot of sense, Herbert. I think you're tapping into a lot of really valuable points there. Tori, do you have any other final questions for Herb?
No, I think that was pretty amazing. And informative. Thank you. I wrote a lot of notes.
That's awesome.
Excellent.
Herb, how can our audience learn more about you? How can they connect with you? How can they learn more about you and your work and the things that you do?
Sure. So, you know, we have a website, Pattern Shifts, www.patternshifts.com. That is our management consultant company. We typically do process improvement, but under that umbrella, you have strategic planning, executive coaching, peer advisory group, and as well as mentoring programs. So those are the things that we do from my consultant company. I was in a space for a moment there with Vistage for about a year, developing a peer advisory model. And, you know, a bit of a challenge, I think, with the pandemic. As I said, some of the decision makers of who would decide, okay, you know, I'm going to have a CEO or CFO or whomever join the company, that didn't occur because it was a perception issue. For example, companies were laying off or identifying employees that had to go on furlough. So some of these leaders, they were conscious of that and felt that from a perception perspective, they didn't want to step in and say to the CFO, I'm going to join this company for whatever X amount of dollars per month. But I would say to you, from Pattern Shifts, we deliver those types of services from an innovative perspective to grow business, to grow individuals professionally and personally.
That's awesome. Herb, thanks for being here. This was an awesome lunch, and I really appreciate being here. Tori, thank you for being here as my co-host. And thank you all for being here as our guests. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day. See you, everybody.
Thank you.